Hello, everyone. Welcome to Due Process. This is Trevor Wyden. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sharon Leal of the renowned International Center for Research in Forensic Psychology. Sharon has her PhD in psychology, where she focused on the central and peripheral physiology of attention and cognitive demand. Sharon's work has led her to working with law enforcement and government with respect to better practices related to deception detection and interviewing. Sharon has been gracious with her time and has been more than helpful in providing research and articles in my study of this topic. And Sharon, we'll start with your role with Portsmouth University. What is your current research and how did you get involved with this topic?
My role is I'm a senior research fellow at the centre. And I first became interested in this topic because my PhD was in psychophysiology, and I was looking basically at what happened in your brain and body during various levels of cognitive demand. Now, when I talk about cognitive demand, that just means various levels of attention and thinking. And at that time, when I was doing that, the cognitive load aspect of deception detection was gaining support. And so I decided to sort of sidestep a little bit and look into what happened when people were lying or telling the truth, in your physiology. So I examined that when people lied or told the truth about where they were at the time of crime and a mock crime. And I found similar patterns amongst lie tellers to those amongst people when they were thinking hard. So it reinforced that idea that this is what's going on. This is an aspect of lie telling, that it increases cognitive load. So that was my first sort of foray into it. And after that, I became a bit hooked. So I'm not so into the psychophysiology now. I concentrate mainly on interview techniques and verbal lie truth detection, so credibility assessment.
So Sharon, is that something then that you were always interested in or just once you did that initial research?
It's after I did the initial research, to be honest, I started to become more and more interested in this, because it was quite a new perspective at the time as well. I think that helped. And moving away from the idea that liars will behave in a nervous way, the sort of interviewing techniques that are used. And because basically it's so important, because the consequences of getting this wrong are incredible, really. I mean, it's just when you think, like, so many people have been wrongly convicted of crimes, innocent people are convicted whilst the perpetrators escape, and false confessions, all sorts of things can result from using deception in the incorrect way, basically.
Right. And I think maybe some people don't realize how important that step is in the investigative process, the interview. So it's very important that law enforcement and people conducting those interviews are conducting them appropriately and with evidence-based practices.
Yes, absolutely.
So the main focus obviously today will be deception detection. And I'll just start with a very general question, Sharon. There's an idea that people are pretty good at detecting when someone is being deceitful or lying to them. In general, is that a myth or is that accurate? Are we as good as we think we are?
No, you're not as good as you think you are. No, it's a myth, unfortunately. I mean, both professionals and lay people are pretty bad, really, at detecting deception. They hover around the 50% mark, which is sort of chance you could flip a coin and get the same. One of the main pitfalls of being a good lie detector is that people really rely on the wrong cues. Often people will look for signs of nervousness, for example, and they're typically not present. Another reason that people overestimate their abilities, this is referring particularly to professional lie catchers, is that they don't get reliable feedback. So, for example, if you consider a situation, let's take customs officers. Suppose you've got two customs officers and that have both been working for 20 years in the job. Both have got completely opposite methods of detection. So one will think that a smuggler will not look them in the eye, whilst his colleague thinks that a smuggler will look him straight in the eye when he's coming through with his case. Both use this technique, both get hits because some people will be smugglers. So both of them get hits, and this reinforces their idea that their technique's correct. However, without science, without opening every bag of everybody that comes through, do you know the misses you make? So both of them doing completely different techniques and using nonverbal behaviours will think that they're absolutely doing really well and that they know after all their experience that they're great at their job, but actually they don't know how well they're doing at all. Without doing everything, which is what we do in science, then you know what cues really work and which ones don't work. So this is a problem with people getting unreliable feedback in all professions. And another reason lay people and professionals alike think that they're going to be good at lie detection is because we underestimate our own ability to lie. we think that others can see when we're lying, and of course they can't, but we think that. And this is due to something in psychology we call the spotlight effect. And I think it's basically when you're telling a lie yourself and you want somebody to be convinced of that lie, you suddenly become very conscious, as if a spotlight's shining on you, of all your behaviours, your nonverbal behaviours, how your voice is, all these things. And because we tend to feel that this is happening, that we're very aware of it. We think others can see into our soul, basically, and they're aware of it too. But they're really not. It's much harder to detect lies than people think.
And is there a distinction, Sharon, to draw between we're talking about detecting lies with strangers rather than looking at your friends and family?
Yeah, with friends and family, it's on an individual level. Some people may have tells, and you might begin to recognise that amongst your own family. But equally, your own family will know you well enough to know what you're looking for and to avoid those. So you can use countermeasures just the same as a stranger would use the normal ones of not appearing nervous, etc. But people can also deceive you because they know what you're looking for and what type of triggers will make you react. So people are still bad at detecting lies, basically.
So in the research that I've looked at and read, there seems to be this idea that we are able to detect lies by observing someone's behaviors or nonverbal cues. And I've seen a lot of people point to that a lot of our communication is done through body language. In chatting off record, you advised me that this could be linked to Albert Mehrabian. Did I say that right?
I'm not sure. I say Moravian, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
Your way sounds better than mine, but essentially, can you just tell us why this myth kind of endures and who he is and how this came to represent that?
He's a psychologist that was conducting research into deception, but one of the studies, for example, was about whether somebody liked or disliked a taste, but they could only say one word, like or dislike. So his research wasn't looking at deception like an investigative interview, but a lot of corporate people and people that want to perpetuate this idea that nonverbal behaviour is so important in lie detection, keep quoting Morabian saying that most of the communication came across non-verbally in his study. Well, yes, of course it did, because in his study he only allowed people to say one word. If he'd allowed them to say no words, then it would have been 100% non-verbal communication, because if you can't speak, of course it's non-verbal communication. And if you'll allow me, I can quote Morabian himself is absolutely upset with the way this has been basically misused. His quotes and his work have been totally misused. And he says, and I quote from his own work here, quote, he says, "I'm obviously uncomfortable about misquotes of my work. From the very beginning, I have tried to give people the correct limitations of my findings. Unfortunately, the field of self-styled corporate image consultants or leadership consultants have numerous practitioners with very little psychological expertise." So that's his own quote in October 2002. He's fed up with people using his work to say that you can use this as a lie detection method, because you should only concentrate on non-verbal when people aren't talking. And if people talk, it's far better to listen to what they're saying. It's a much better tool to detect deceit than watching their behaviour. When you're talking about deception, it's different because people control their non-verbal behaviour. Liars will strategically use countermeasures.
And we'll get into that a little bit here in a few moments. But this idea that we can detect someone if they're lying to us or being deceptive of us through nonverbal cues or behaviorisms, this isn't a new idea, correct? This has been around for a long time.
Yes, oh yeah, it's been around. Well, I think when the Bible was written, they used to think that you could look into the soul. The eyes were windows to the soul. So if you were doing something, averting gaze or something, then that was showing that you didn't want them to see into your soul, etc. So yes, it's been around, yeah, forever, I think.
Is there now a consensus that these nonverbal cues are unreliable in detecting deception?
Yeah, absolutely. The key researchers in this area, that's scientists that publish in good journals and, with peer-reviewed journals. There is a consensus that they don't work. The cues are weak, they're unreliable, non-verbal cues. And also you've got the problem, if you've got officers or law officials concentrating on them, they could easily be missing other important verbal cues while they're trying to do that. But yeah, there is a consensus amongst key researchers that they just do not work, and you should focus on verbal cues where possible.
Is there a reason that this idea that we can focus on someone's behaviorisms, despite all the research and consensus that now exists, is there a reason that you think it continues to be used and endured?
Yeah, I think there is. I think it's because people mistakenly they've got an unrealistic idea of how they behave themselves. So, as I was explaining earlier about the spotlight effect, because when they're lying, they themselves think that they're making these like non-verbal cues, such as fidgeting or averting their gaze, pulling their ears, those sorts of things. They believe that it's intuitive to them to buy into this training and this kind of advice that tells them that other people that are lie teller will be doing this. The fact that it's incorrect, they seem to ignore that, but that's I think that's one reason why they do keep buying into it, and also because they've got bias feedback, as we said before. So they've had hits when they've looked at somebody and they have been nervous and they've been right, and they ignore the times that they've got it wrong. And saying about comparison, people think what they're doing far more when they're lying than when they're telling the truth. So we ran a study, for example, with like our UK James Bonds, where they had to lie or tell the truth, and they went on a mission. And what we found was that they believed that when they were lying, they were making far more movements than when they were telling the truth. In fact, it was the opposite. They were making far more movements when they were telling the truth, but they weren't aware of what they're doing when they're telling the truth. And this is something we call, in psychological terms, we call this illusion of transparency amongst truth tellers. Is that it's kind of the opposite to the spotlight effect, and the fact that you think that your truthfulness will shine through. So you think I'm telling the truth. They must know that I'm telling the truth, and so you don't concentrate so much on what you're physically doing. You're thinking verbally, telling the truth, and you don't concentrate so much on what you're physically doing. So you tend to move more. If anything, truth tellers will move more than liars.
And that's because they just think that the truth is just going to come out and that they're going to be believed.
They're going to be believed. And another problem, of course, is that fictional crime series. It's very popular to perpetuate the idea that non-verbal cues are good indicators of deceit. Such as shows like Lie to Me and many others. I've seen it on a lot of things, and people like to look at that and think, oh, that they could learn to do that, and that I can be trained to spot if somebody shows a micro expression or something. But there's no evidence to show any of that works. And even though people would like the idea that it works, like it's a magic bullet, so to speak, it doesn't. Nothing at all in science backs that up.
It's a nice idea to think that we would be able to do that, almost a superpower in a way.
And I think police officers and intelligence officers, they like the idea. It's sold to them in that way. You're going to be correct. You knew this all along, that people behave in this shifty way, and now I'm telling you that you're correct. But I'm going to tell you how to do this better and how to use this. So they buy into it because they like that idea that they've been doing it right all along anyway, but they're going to get better at it. But in fact, it just makes them worse at detecting deception. They get worse.
So there is research that suggests that liars, as you've indicated, they do feel more nervous than truth tellers. They're more aware of what they're saying and maybe the movements that they're making. How are liars able to suppress their nervousness or the movements that they think is indicative of deception?
I mean, you'll always get individual differences, but on the whole, liars, they suppress what they're doing because for a number of different reasons. One, they actively try to suppress it. So they'll think, I must look you straight in the eye because you'll be looking for that. I must try and sound confident. I mustn't fidget. So they're thinking about that. But also, I know from my research, talking earlier about my PhD research into this area, is that cognitive load actually suppresses, not just my research, this is other people's research from cognitive load area, it actually suppresses extra physiological activity. So you will fidget less, you'll naturally move less with cognitive load. So the more you have to think hard, the less you will move. I mean, we can easily demonstrate this, we demonstrate it in training, but if you have to think hard, you'll move less. You can often see if you're following somebody down the street and they're reading their phone or something, and then they suddenly stop to answer a text or something, it's because as soon as they think hard, it suppresses their movements. So that will happen with a lie teller, but because they've got loads of extra things to think about, whereas a truth teller is just going back to their memory, and they're not getting that physiological suppression. So their movements will be abnormal, and so they'll be moving more. I mean, in fact, some recent studies by a colleague of mine, Samantha Mann, were quite interesting in this area. She looked at people smuggling a laptop on a boat with ostensibly some intelligence codes and etc. on it. And what she found was she interviewed them all afterwards, and she found that liars reported being more nervous than truth tellers. But when we got observers to look at it, we couldn't find, there was absolutely no difference. You couldn't see any difference in liars or truth tellers. And then, so she upped the ante, and she basically got people to actually walk up to the lie tellers and, sort of give them a strange look, etc. And the lie tellers felt even more nervous. But what happened in that situation was the truth tellers actually showed the nerves, not the lie teller. So when people, again, independently rated it, the truth tellers looked far more nervous than the liars. Even though the liars felt more nervous, they suppressed those behaviours. And truth tellers, because if somebody walks up and looks at you, truth tellers displayed nervous behaviours. So an independent observer would have thought the truth tellers were the guilty ones if they were paying attention to nonverbal behaviours.
That's really interesting. It's almost like the truth teller's defenses were down.
Yeah, they're not trying to. If somebody stands in your personal space or looks at you in a strange way, then because you're not hiding anything, you're not trying to suppress these behaviours. And we know from the fact that the spot techniques and stuff in America were disbanded because basically it wasn't working. Looking for all these signs of nervousness, even though you're going to get some hits, as I said, you're always going to get some hits using anything. A blind squirrel occasionally finds a nut, so it doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
working.
Yeah, and the spot checks is interesting, obviously, because certain communities in our societies are just unfortunately more nervous to talk to law enforcement or police officers. So the implications of that study are interesting in terms of, I think there's you could tie it into wrongful convictions in a way, because if honest, truthful people are just being nervous and then that nervousness is being used as a sign of deception or guilt, that's obviously problematic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's been so many cases of false confessions and wrongful convictions based on demeanour, basically, where the investigators have used, say, for example, the Reid technique, and in this kind of accusatory way that makes people more nervous anyway, and then says because they're nervous, they have to be guilty.
So let's stick with the Reid technique here for a moment. I know in the UK they've moved far away from Reid, from what I understand, and they're using the peace model. But in North America, certainly in Canada, Reid technique continues to be used, and this is a form of behavioral analysis. Some people say it's a guilt presumptive interview. Is there any research? I mean, I already know the answers to this, but is there any research that backs up this style of interviewing where you're looking at behavioral cues?
The research I know about, there's nothing to overall. The consensus is it really does not work, and it isn't backed up. You get the responses from truth tellers if you use these techniques. As I was just saying, if you, for example, one of the techniques getting close to the suspect, or it makes truth tellers react in a nervous way. We also know that when we get police officers that have been trained in the Reid technique, or they use Reid technique methods, and then we show them, again, this is my colleague Samantha Mann, showed them clips of real life high stake interviews. These are cases of rape, murder, arson. And the ones that used these Reid technique cues actually performed far worse than people that didn't use them, than officers that didn't use them. So the research shows it doesn't work. And no, it is not backed up, and it's unscientific. They use the thing that, oh, it's because I'm a police officer, I know, but as we've been over, just you don't instinctively know that just because you've had experience that you're actually correct. And more, people are moving away from, well, we hope people are beginning to move away from this in the techniques they use. I think because so many wrongful convictions and false confessions and things like, nowadays you're getting more people are making programs about it, like Netflix, Making a Murderer, etc. Really pulling apart these techniques. The Amanda Knox case. I mean, it's the effects are horrendous. It's awful. It ruins people's lives, and yet they're still perpetuating the same thing. It hasn't changed in 50 years. I mean, what doesn't move on in 50 years? It's you can tell I'm a bit emotional about the Reid technique, but because of the amount of injustices that have been caused by using this technique, I'm very much against it, and it doesn't work, in my opinion.
And I mean, in Canada, there is pieces starting to, from what I've read, gain more momentum, or at least that type of just trying to elicit information and letting the potential suspect speak. And the RCMP is our main national police force here, and they've incorporated, they call it a phased integration model where it kind of combines Reid and the peace model. So it's interesting to watch the developments here in Canada, see what direction we're going to be headed in.
Yeah, I was going to say, although they are still using it, they are slowly moving away from it. In the US, for example, there's a big push now to work with, where we work with practitioners. So the sort of merging of science and practice, whereby, it's mutually beneficial. They inform our research protocols, and we can then advise them about how best to deal with those protocols in real life in their cases that they face. So we're beginning to work far more closely now with practitioners than we used to, and we're finding it mutually beneficial.
That's excellent because from my experiences, I think there would be a real appetite. I think some people, some law enforcement officials, just don't know that this research exists and that there are potentially better practices that you could incorporate in investigative interviewing. So I think the more we can work together and certainly use evidence-based practices, that's awesome. I do want to give just some pushback from maybe someone, a proponent of Reid might say that, okay, you have your research and this is all done in a sanitized environment or a laboratory. You don't know what it's like doing it practically. We've used it for however many years, 50 years, and we know we're successful or we've had success with this style of interviewing. So you have your laboratory results, but we have these practical real life results. How would you respond to a critique like that?
Well, I would say that some of the research that we're quoting here, like Samantha Mann's research, was actually using real life cases, so using arsonists, rapists, murderers. So we have done research with real cases as well, and I would say that yeah, they probably have had some hits with their cases, but they've had some absolutely shocking failures as well. So many cases of wrongful convictions and false confessions, as I said before. Also, we know from other research there isn't actually that much difference in how people behave, whether it's a real life situation or a high stake laboratory situation that we simulate. And the meta analysis, like a melting pot of all the research in the area, and then they pick out what the big bits that come out of that. And that doesn't show that there is any difference. So you still will get the same behaviours. And the people we work with, the feedback we get from practitioners is that it's working. And we hope to be able to publish more on that soon, but watch this space on that. We're waiting for certain permissions.
Great. I imagine there's some hoops you have to jump through to be able to publish some of the results. So let's now turn to what research is suggesting is a more effective technique in potentially detecting deception. A lot of research is now focused on the verbal analysis or so-called active interviewing of investigative interviews. What is this active verbal method and how is it being used when interviewing suspects?
Well, an active verbal approach to detecting credibility it just refers to using interview techniques that are designed to elicit information, so get as much information as possible, and from that information, what cues to credibility are there. And so you analyse the verbal responses. It differs to what we call passively interviewing, where just ask questions that are not evidence based, so you're not backed up by science, because our questions with the active method, we've tested them scientifically. So they just ask questions and then observe behaviours. So that's a bit of the Reid technique. So active methods work and they prove the ability to detect truths and lies. And again, there's a lot of research in this area, and the meta-analysis on this back up that they are far superior to using passive methods and looking at non-verbal behaviours, to using active methods, that specific techniques, and using verbal responses. Information gathering, get them to talk as much as possible. So to use a comparison, often in the Reid technique, for example, they'll interrupt the interviewee all the time. In investigative interviewing, in information gathering, you want them to talk. You want the person to talk as much as possible. for lie tellers, also give them enough rope to hang themselves, so to speak. You can make life easier for lie tellers by keep asking questions rather than just letting them talk. So it's better to just get as much information out of people as possible.
So, in terms of the verbal strategies used, has there been much research in determining the differences between truth tellers, maybe the verbal and information they would give, versus the liars or someone that's being deceptive? Is there anything that researchers focus on in terms of what these people are saying?
Yeah, there's been a lot of research in this area. There's research concerning like something called CBCA, content-based criteria analysis, that is, that shows that truthful accounts tend to differ to deceitful accounts. There's reliability monitoring that looks at like experiences, how well you talk about things you've actually genuinely experienced as opposed to imagined or fabricated. Both of those have shown scientific support. For ours, we use a method and we train on a method called cognitive credibility assessment. And in that, we try and basically get as much information as possible. And then we look at the type of information we get. And what we find is that truth tellers' accounts tend to be more complex than liars. And then they also provide more details that can be verified. This is work by a colleague of mine called Galit Nahari, and she found that lie tellers tend to avoid providing details that you can check. So she started looking at that, and so we look at that in our responses. For example, if somebody was going to lie and pretend that they were interviewed by you today, they might be vague about what your name was, and they might not say the exact site it was going to be. They might just talk a lot around the area. Whereas for me, I could say your name, Trevor Wadden from Canada. I could also talk about the interactions that happened during this interview today. Talking about complexity, the sort of things that happened starting our talk, etc. And one of the things we look for as well is something called core details versus peripheral details. So the core details would be, in this example, would be me speaking about the interaction in our actual interview, what you asked me, what was said, etc. And peripheral details would be what happens afterwards, the contacting me beforehand, and things like that. So we train people and look at that to be able to understand what type of details they should be looking at and how to analyse these. And importantly, we train law enforcement professionals, professional lie catchers basically, to be able to try and observe these in real time, so that when they're actually having a conversation with somebody, they can make these observations.
And sorry, Sharon, so the core details are the ones that truth tellers are more likely to give?
Yes. Well, truth tellers will give a mixture of both, but lie tellers will try to avoid the core details, perhaps for a number of reasons, partly because they didn't actually happen, and it's easier to often, most people will embed a lie. So they could, if I wanted to lie and say that I'd talked to you, I've talked to other journalists in the past, I could use that sort of situation and lie about the peripheral stuff by sort of making out, that how I was contacted via email, that sort of thing. I could basically make that up, but the actual core of, what you look like, what you asked me, those kind of details in the actual interview would be more difficult for me to lie about. So we find that lie tellers tend to say more peripheral details and less details that you can check. You can actually, less concrete details. So they will want to be detailed because they want you to believe them, and they know that people look for the amount of detail, but it's the type of detail that they provide, and that's what train people to better understand that.
Okay, just to be clear though, I guess there's some different strategies under this verbal, letting a suspect talk as much as possible, but that seems to be the consensus, is that it's better to let whoever you're talking to just provide as much information as possible, letting them talk, not interrupting them, and then you can verify some of those details and look at the details they're providing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they need to talk, and all the basically intelligence officials we work with back that up. It's better to get the person to speak. And you're far more likely to do that as well if you're using friendly, investigative approach to their interview. If you start accusing somebody, both lie tellers and truth tellers can just turn around and say, well, you don't believe me, I'm going to shut up now. So you're more likely to get information if you're using a friendly approach, so a non-accusatory approach, but just asking the questions. You get as much out of their memory as possible as well using this credibility assessment method, and then just listen to.
So we'll shift gears here now, Sharon, and I just want to touch on the continued use or belief in, certainly in Canada's justice system, that we can assess a witness's credibility and honesty by considering demeanor and the way they act while they're on the witness stand. So for instance, there's still very popular Canadian textbooks that are used by law schools that were published within the last year that indicate that this is an acceptable thing for jurors to do, that when they're watching or hearing testimony, they can assess demeanor while on the stand. And to be fair to our courts, our judges will give instructions to jurors to tell them that, this shouldn't be determinative. There's other factors you need to look at. And they usually give a laundry list of what those other factors are, like other testimony and the actual physical evidence. But it's still on the list. And in Canada, we have jury secrecy laws. So we don't know how much weight it's very difficult to know how much weight jurors are putting on demeanor. But certainly with all the research that indicates that we all have biases and other things we may not be aware of that influence our judgment, do you have concern that in our justice system or in any justice system, any type of consideration of demeanor or nonverbal cues in assessing credibility is still being used?
Yeah, absolutely. Very concerning because we know that people make mistakes. On the whole, people look for the wrong cues. So if they're told to look at demeanour, then they're going to typically look at things that aren't cues to deceit, and they're going to make mistakes. So for years we've been trying to dispel these myths, and I don't know why justice systems aren't taking any notice of science here. Because, as I said before, the majority of science shows that these cues are very unreliable. They don't relate to whether a person's being deceptive or not. And there's people again that have been convicted because they're either not emotional enough, or they're fidgeting, or they look nervous. And really, it's just as in my mind, it's just as unscientific as saying, putting up some fingerprints on the screen and saying to the jury, oh, have a guess, is that a match to this person or not? Because you wouldn't do that, but yet he or she will use something equally as unscientific by telling the jury to judge demeanour. They'll make mistakes by doing that, and again, with potentially catastrophic consequences. So I don't think they should be using it.
Right. And there's certainly a reluctance in Canada for courts to use experts or people knowledgeable in this area. And a lot of the pushback, there's a whole legal test, which I won't get into, when in Canadian courts we can admit expert evidence. But what judges and what the critique usually is that this falls in the realm of common sense. Do you think most people are aware of this research, or that it's as common as courts like to think it is?
No, people are unaware of it, and vast majority of people will be unaware of it, I should say. And most people will believe exactly the opposite from watching media programs, all these crime series, etc. They will believe that people will look nervous and display those kind of signs of nervousness if they're guilty. So people have got, not only, it's not even a level playing field. They're actually going to be actively looking for the wrong cues. So it's relying on their common sense. Basically, we know it doesn't work, their common sense. It's 50% accurate at best. And once they start really looking for the cues of nervousness, they actually get worse than that even. So it's terrible that it's still being used. I think at the very least, the courts should actually direct the jury that they shouldn't look at nonverbal behaviours, they shouldn't look at demeanour, because there's absolutely no scientific evidence to back it up that this will indicate whether the person is lying or telling the truth. People are much better when they listen to accounts than when they see them. That's another overwhelming research, by the way. If you just listen to an account rather than look at somebody, you're already much better at detecting deceit or truth.
Which is very interesting, because our court system puts such an emphasis on cross examinations, which are important. Don't get me wrong; I'm not saying cross examination isn't important. It's important, obviously, to elicit and to challenge on certain details and information. But part of that idea is that when you're challenging someone or cross examining them, you get to see how they behave and fidget or blush, those sorts of things. So it's very interesting to me that we put such an emphasis on that, and yet we are very reluctant to discuss this research and science and just leave it to quote unquote common sense. But I just want to end our discussion today, Sharon, and we talked about obviously the verbal approach, and eliciting information is seems to be the direction that interviewing is headed and continues to head. and more strategies are being developed. Do you ever see nonverbal cues making a comeback, or a situation where they could still be used, or justified in using them?
Yeah, I think obviously in situations more research is needed in situations where the person doesn't talk. So if you've got opportunity for a person to talk, use that. If you haven't, like observing people at airports or on ferries, anything like that, then the only option to you is non-verbal. So more research is needed on that. But perhaps you need to start they need to start from looking at the other way around. What behaviours non-verbally are they displaying? Is it signs of nervousness? Well, we think not, because the research that's been done already on that shows it's not, or they haven't found any evidence for it, basically. So maybe it's the opposite, that people won't look nervous, or they'll actually look calmer when they're approached, etc., or something. So I mean, I don't know, but yeah, more research is definitely needed in that area, because you can understand that there is a problem faced by security officials, that they need to try and see non-verbal cues. But yeah, they need to really research more what these are, not just necessarily look for nervousness.
Well, this is a really, really fascinating area, and I'm glad that there's more attention being put on it, and more emphasis, because I am hopeful that court systems and law enforcement will continue to welcome people such as yourself into their training, and listen to the training and incorporate these evidence-based practices. But Sharon, it's been really, really great talking with you today. Your insights were awesome to have. Where can people go to learn more about your research?
They can go to my website at the University of Portsmouth, so Sharon Leal at Portsmouth University. And also my colleague, Professor Alda Vrij, that's Vrij. And you can just click on research output, and you'll see all of our articles. Got quite a number of articles. They're all on there. And they can contact me at the University of Portsmouth as well if they want any further information.
Yeah, those articles have been very helpful, and there's lots of great research on there. So when we get this interview up, we'll make sure to post those links in the show notes, and so people can access the research. So Sharon, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care.